Hey, it's Michael, and I've got a question for you. How far out do your thoughts go when you think about the future? Into your old age? In the years after you've left life behind? What about generations beyond? Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we communicate well. What we have been taught about communication and what has been modeled and incentivized through culture has left us in a place where we know how to exert our ideas and opinions and beliefs onto each other, but we miss the entire other half of conversation, the extraction. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before, to teach you how to ask curious questions, how to seek understanding over certainty, how to listen and give space, so that ultimately you might become a better communicator. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for rather than what we are against. If you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you may have noticed, as I have, a subtle clue to how we communicate with each other across differences and divides that has been hidden in many of the conversations that I've had. And it has to do with the role our emotions play. Some guests have made it a bit more obvious, like Leanne Davey back in episode 19, when she cautioned us that facts don't solve fights. Others were a bit more, shall I say, ethereal, like Reverend Adam Russell Taylor in episode 70, when he asked us to imagine a bigger story of us, a beloved community. However, this week's guest lays it out plainly. When examining a path forward through conflicts and how we envision our future as a society and as people, we must pay heed to the shared humanity that exists within our emotions. Ari Wallach calls this consideration of our emotions as being full-spectrum human beings who can go forward, backward, and inward in our thoughts. Ari is a futurist, the founder and executive director of Longpath Labs, and the author of the book Longpath: Becoming the Great Ancestors Our Future Needs, an Antidote for Short-termism. In Longpath, which is a state of mind that recognizes how our decisions today affect the lives of generations after us, Ari argues that we are at a critical juncture in our time as humans, where examining our desired future as a species requires asking some uncomfortable questions, empathizing with generations past, present, and future, and leaning into relational tensions. Ari and I discuss the nature of the time we're living in, which Ari relates to the turbulent intertidal zone of the ocean, and how your role and my role is not to convince each other to think the same, but to explore commonalities that exist and build upon them. You write a lot about the need to, I'll say, reintroduce emotion and feeling and intuition and even awe into our decision-making process. And I get the sense that you think a lot of that has been tamped down. And you even write, feelings have been deemed irrelevant at best, counterproductive at worst. And my question for you, Ari, as we kick things off here is, what precipitated you going down that path? Why was reintroducing feeling and emotion into the decision-making process something that was important enough for you to write about?
Wow, going deep fast. It's great. So first of all, thanks for having me. I can give you the depersonal and the personal reasons why. So, and I'll start with the depersonal and move into the personal, if that's okay with you.
I love it. Yeah.
So what I talk about in the book is kind of and we'll get to this. So, I'm not going to go too far into it right now, but we're kind of in this intertidal moment between what was and what will be. And when the follow-up question was, well, if we're in this intertidal that we've been in here for a decade or two, when was the last time we kind of went through something like this that was tectonic, if not globally, at least within a large sphere of influence? And I often say, well, it was a movement, at least in the global north and in the west, moving from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And part and parcel of what the Renaissance and really the Enlightenment was about in terms of kind of the scientific method and the atomization and the understanding of how the world works, which was about breaking it down into its most minimal parts, like the atom or the cell, and then trying to understand reality from there, meant that in this scientific way, if you could not measure it, it didn't exist. At best, at worst, it was actually superfluous and actually was in the way. So in many ways, when I say all that, what room does that leave for emotion? Like no room, right? And I'm not saying scientists and technology is inherently dispassionate, but what I'm saying is that the role of emotion writ large was something that we really didn't understand, and in some ways are just starting to kind of understand right now. But at the end of the day, it was very much kind of pushed out of our reality in terms of how we want to understand the world. And so I think that has come at a major significant cost of how we think about ourselves in the world and where we want to go in the world. So that's the depersonal version, right? The personal version is, and you'll read about this in my book, and I don't mean to overstate this, overplay this, but my father was born in the 1920s in Poland, Jewish, and lost basically his entire family in the Holocaust, and at one point had to escape the Jewish ghetto, basically literally by the skin of his teeth, watching his father basically get killed in front of him. And then lived in the forest for several years as a part of the Jewish underground, the partisan unit. And then after the war, did Nazi hunting and a whole bunch of other stuff. And so without obviously having to go into too much detail about this is a pretty kind of certain levels of trauma in seeing this and living this out. And because he was kind of a generation that didn't talk about these things, a silent generation, I grew up in a home, a very loving, very understanding, very amazing home, but one in which the realm of emotions, while my mom was an artist and, Buckminster Fuller and Jung were her mentors in many ways, both literally physically and whatnot. I saw so much more in hindsight. My father passed away when I was 18, but so much more in hindsight, my father could have been in the world had he been able to access and be more in touch with emotions in general. He wasn't like dead on the inside in that kind of way, but I saw kind of firsthand what happens when we don't deal with what's really there at the emotional layer. And so you take those two things together, and as a kind of both a futurist, which is an odd term, but a futurist and someone who came up in academia in the realms of psychology and anthropology and sociology, in trying to figure out and come up with how I thought strategically individuals and society writ large can kind of navigate this intertidal moment, I realized what was needed was not a set of answers, not a 7-step method, but really a mindset, which is at the heart of Longpath. You should think of Longpath as a mindset more than anything else. There aren't strict rules, it's ways of seeing. And one of those is about kind of re-emotionalizing oneself and the world so that we can make better decisions and move away from the hyper-rational. There's a time for logos and rationality. There's also, and I believe we are in this moment right now, for ethos and pathos and passions and understanding. It's not about emotions running amok, but it's about understanding their place in our reality and even in our physiology so that we can make the kind of decisions that we need to make to move forward as individuals and as a society in this intertidal moment.
You mentioned early on in your answer that there is a cost to not accessing those emotions. Ari, what is that cost? You kind of hit on it there towards the end of your answer, but I'd love to double click into that. What are the costs of not accessing our emotions when faced with everything that we're faced with today?
I mean, look, let's be clear. It can be cognitively, and I know I'm mixing my realms of the brain, but cognitively taxing and overloading if we over-index on emotionality. There's so much kind of pain and suffering in the world right now that if we access it and let it and open it too much, it can actually become paralyzing. That being said, we've become so numb in how we view these both macro wicked level problems like climate change, obviously being the big one, or refugees, an area that I've worked a lot of my professional life in, that we get to a point where we just kind of shut off. And we become, and this is the subtitle of the book, an antidote to short-termism, we become overly short-termistic in how we make decisions. And some decisions defy the logical in terms of what we need to do and what we need to be doing. And so what emotions can do on two things. One, they open us up. And this is the role of empathy. And we'll get into the term transgenerational empathy, I'm sure, in a moment. Mm-hmm. But it opens us up to what is actually going on and moves us past the numbness. That's at an individual level. And in some ways, a kind of self-interested level, to be honest with you. Again, at this larger macro level, what it allows us to do is start actually thinking very creatively about what it is we want and what is our ultimate aim and goal as a species. Talk about this in the book too, as a kind of the third pillar of, I'm hitting everything, the third pillar of Longpath, this idea of telos, which I know we'll get to in a second, or if not a second, in a few minutes. And this is what, especially the pro-social emotions, empathy and awe and kind of wonder, allow us to access something more than what's right in front of us. And that when you access that more than what's right in front of us, you actually can start to dream about things being radically different than they are right now in a way that leads to a much more healthy self and a much more healthy society. So it's kind of like emotions to me, to kind of speak in, I come somewhat from a organizational corporate strategy world and kind of cut my teeth in Silicon Valley. Like, emotion is the ultimate hack, which is interesting because a lot of folks are talking about kind of long-termism right now through different movements in different ways and how we kind of need to be hyper rational and emotions are actually bad. I actually argue the exact opposite. I think emotions are great. They cannot overtake you. But if you deny them in one way or another, it will lead to you thinking about solutions and ways of being that will actually not serve you or society in the end.
Gosh, that was such a good answer. I wanted you to keep going. Ari, you've mentioned intertidal, and I loved the visual that gives, but set up the rest of the conversation for the audience by describing how you referred to this moment in time, the intertidal, and what that means for us. What are we experiencing right now, in your view?
So let's start off where the idea of I'm not an oceanographer per se. That's not my field of study. But the intertidal, for anyone who's ever been on a coast, you've kind of experienced this, right? The tide comes in, the tide comes out, which actually is a little bit of a scientific misnomer. It's actually the Earth rotates, and the bulge of the water that's pulled between the moon and the sun, we rotate in that. But we don't have to be. We'll just say the tide coming in and out. But I've been called out on that. So I want to be clear. I understand tides do not come in and out. We rotate in the bulge of water that surrounds our planet.
We're nothing if not scientifically accurate here.
Yes, I want to be very accurate about that. Yeah. I don't want to get emailed. I got an email from someone saying, no, that is incorrect. You never say the tide goes. No, I know. But for the sake of conversation, the water rises and lowers. Now, the intertidal is this amazing area of land that is sometimes submerged underwater and sometimes is exposed. And the intertidal layer and zone can vary based on where it is in the planet. Sometimes it can be exposed for hours. Sometimes it's just a sandbar. It's more often than not a place where if you've ever gone kind of tide pooling, right? And this is, again, around the world, you see that is an intertidal area, right? Because there is a point where, and what's amazing about the intertidal zone is you get the most amazing creatures, right? These kind of mussels that when the water goes out, they actually trap water in their shell, and kind of sea cucumbers and snails and different kinds of fish that know how to survive in this in-between zone. That is where we are. We are in this in-between zone. I talked about it a little bit earlier, we're kind of coming, I believe, to kind of the end of what the Enlightenment can give us, right? So what the Enlightenment, I'll ground this in a hard example. What the Enlightenment will tell us when we look at a forest, especially when you fold in kind of late stage Western capitalism, if Michael and Ari were to stand at the edge of a large forest, what the Enlightenment tells us is we are looking at millions and millions of feet of lumber, of board feet that can go to build houses. Like we kind of break it down very quickly. Like, how can we sell this, or how can we monetize this forest? Or the forest is just made up of these individual trees, and that's what we should focus on. And we all know that is not necessarily the case. I have no problem about turning trees. I actually am a woodworker, so I need trees in that sense. But what is happening right now is we're able to just kind of step back, and from a systems perspective, as opposed to the atomization kind of perspective, which is what we're driven through in the Enlightenment and industrialization and the scientific revolution. From a systems perspective, we know that if Michael and Ari, God heaven forbid, were to cut down all the trees, we couldn't just, especially in the rainforest in many ways, even a better example, we couldn't just plant trees and in X number of years, the forest would come back again. It's not that simple. Everything is connected from an atomic to a biological to even a quantum level. So that being said, we know this intuitively, but our systems are we know this intuitively. Our systems for how the world works says this is not the case anymore. And we see this probably most manifest, to take it out of the realm of the philosophical, in how, especially in America, but around the world, people are losing trust in institutions and in narratives about how the world works and be it what the American dream is or what kind of any dream is. They lose. I just saw the Supreme Court in the U.S. is at the lowest level of trust. It's now being felt like it's actually a political body when it was never supposed to be. To me, that's kind of the latest kind of example of this. And so while that's happening, in this moment of kind of narrative and trust breakdown, nothing has actually, we don't know what's next. We're in this intertidal, in this in-between. And we call this, by the way, this term is known as kind of an interregnum between popes or between kings, right? And so recognizing this, in the organization I run, Longpath Labs, we look at megatrends and all these things, and we know we're in intertidal. And before I started actually writing this book, I was thinking, okay, like, how do we, as someone who's been working in, for lack of better terminology, strategy for 25 plus years, people were coming to me and saying, wow, this moment we're in is kind of chaos and flux and volatility. And what comes next, right? Just as a futurist, tell us what comes next so we can get through. And I realized that's where things can be dangerous, when someone says, I have the answer of what it looks like on the other side of this intertidal. And we'll get to what happens when people do that, because many people are doing that, especially in the political sphere right now. And so I realized that what was necessary was a flexible, adaptive way of thinking, a mindset to, again, kind of navigate through this moment. And the book kind of ends, there was a kind of a critical review of the book saying, I love the book until the end, but the author never actually told us what comes next. What kind of book about the future is this if they don't tell us the answers? And I don't think they read close enough, because several times in the book I say, I'm not going to tell you the answers. I'm going to give you a way of thinking and seeing the world, but recognize that what comes on the other side of this intertidal has to be collectively co-created along a certain set of kind of values-based principles, and specifically around a telos, a larger aim, if we want to make it through. But actually saying what that other side looks like is not only deleterious, but actually extremely dangerous. And so the intertidal is kind of how I set up the why, the what's going on, but the why in terms of the needs for this mindset at this point in time in the kind of larger, arc of Homo sapien, both history, presence, and future.
Ari, there are many conversations that I've had where they say similar things to what you're saying in terms of our ability to first be introspective about what it is that we're experiencing in our place in the world and how the effect that we want to have. And this moment of, or not even this moment, this practice of self-awareness. And my question that I've asked several people that I also want to ask you, Ari, is how do we get more people to step into that self-awareness, to step into that moment of first questioning themselves and their beliefs and their ideas and the ways that they are moving about the world before we start, pointing the finger at other people? How do we encourage that introspection, that self-awareness?
Well, so I think it's a great question, and I'm going to go back. If that's step one, let's go back to step 0 or -1, right? Which is a recognition that self-awareness is a continual process, right? And so it's not a destination. You know this. Self-awareness is a verb, right? It's something that we are kind of constantly doing. It's not a noun. It's not a destination. We never get there. Much like the future is a verb and not a noun. It's something that's continual in a process. Unfortunately, Michael, for us, more often than not, we don't usually begin that process until we hit bottom, right? It could be a terrible relationship with our parents or with a partner or a job or something kind of acute and traumatic happen. That, and I'll argue the reason for that is kind of the way we're hardwired over the past 200,000 years. So there's not much we can necessarily do about that right now. One of the things that I talk about in the book is this kind of, and again, the moment that why this intertitle from kind of the Middle Ages, where really, and again, I'm privileging the North and the West in this conversation. I recognize that, but why the church, capital T, capital C, had so much power, especially in Europe and in the kind of the Western imagination, and the church had developed an amazing process for kind of self-actualization, with the stick or the carrot being that on the other side, based on what you did according to the parameters of the church, would lead to, eternal heaven or eternal hell. Okay, so along comes the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and part of what it does is it takes away the power of the church. This is like the Copernican revolution. Like the church doesn't have all the answers. And so that's when we say, okay, we're not only are we throwing out, this goes back to your earlier set of questions, not only are we going to throw out emotion, but we're going to throw out this idea that the inner life is of importance in terms of understanding who you are in a kind of almost soulful way. We can understand who you are at a physiological, biological way. We're built, we dig up dead bodies. We have these amazing, anatomy drawings. But the idea of kind of self-awareness kind of gets taken out because it's not something that we can quantify or measure. So again, we have to kind of, and you'll see me do this a lot, kind of put the answer to a question like that within a historical context of how we got there, because we have to understand how we got there if we kind of want to move forward. So how do we get folks to do that without, quote unquote, having to hit bottom, and at the same time saying that it can't just be religion who will kind of guide us through. I'm kind of a practicing Jew, right? Like in many ways. That being said, I don't think religion is necessarily the answer for everyone, or in the way that it's practiced can work for everyone. And so how we get folks to want to kind of jump on this self-awareness train, which I think is kind of like at the heart of this, is the question, or at least the question set, is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, right? Because I was wrestling with, well, religion's not going to give it. And what I was also seeing was, and I mean this in no, I don't mean ill on anyone when I say this, but when I looked and I went to the bookstore, like an actual physical bookstore, and I would see kind of two sections that interested me. I saw kind of current affairs, current events, politics, political science. I saw that section I gravitated towards. Then there was also what was called really kind of self-help or personal transformation or self-awareness. I saw that section. And when I went to actually, when you have a book like this, you go to the different publishers and, you kind of have to pitch them and do all these, like a song and dance. And they would always ask me the same thing. They'd say, what part of the bookstore is this in? Is this like political science, current affairs, the inner title, history, science? But there's also all this self-awareness in there. And I said, well, why do we have to live by the norms of the bookstore? Like, what about if we combine the two shelves together? And it was like self-awareness to make a better world, not just self-awareness to make a better Ari or a better Michael or a better Jane or Jim. And so my contribution, there's many, my contribution to this is to say the reason we want to become more self-aware and go into this process, Michael, yes, from a self-interest way, because it will make you more present in your relationships and probably a happier individual and all these great things. Like, there'll be a lot of pain in there, but it'll make your life better because you won't be living with so many like numb layers around you. But secondarily, it if you do this and you engage in this process, what ends up ultimately happening is you are laying a foundation for generations to come. Because if you go through this process, it's not just about you, it's about your descendants. Why? Because as you move through the continual process of self-awareness and self-actualization in a way that is not just narcissistic and not just, I'm not saying Michael or Ari do this, I'll speak about myself in the third person, I know, but in a way that changes our relations and our behaviors so we can model those for those around us. And if those around us happen to be the next generation, our own kids, or anyone that will live past us, we end up doing is laying these foundational layers so the generations that come after us actually get to start off at a higher plane of self-awareness, right? I mean, like, we're all born, I'm not, by the way, to be clear, I'm not arguing that self-awareness is like transferred between mother and father in some like mystical way. But what ends up happening is if we do the work, those around us are the next generation. If we're continually raising them and we're conscious parents or conscious allo parents, they don't have to be your own genetic kids. What ends up happening if you step out of yourself in your own lifespan, 100, 200, 300, 400 years, which is like really nothing, that you start to all of a sudden it's game changing. So my answer to your question is you do it because it's right for you right now. It'll work for you, but really it's your contribution. This is why the book is called Becoming the Great Ancestors Our Future Needs. You become a great ancestor. Yes, it's voting a certain way, consuming a certain way, buying an electric, those outward ways. But the real deep argument in this book is not only should you do that, but by going on this path of self-awareness and understanding of who you are, you can future better. You can have better and more empathetic kind of ways of thinking about how you want the future to manifest on the creative side. But then your contribution to those that you will meet along the way is that you are meeting them as a better Michael or a better Ari in a way, because emotions are very contagious, in a way that kind of sets up these next generations to continue to take the baton and move forward faster in making us an overall better society.
Ari, you've mentioned empathy several times here. You've even mentioned the term transgenerational empathy, which you wrote about in the book. And I'm curious why the idea of Longpath is not just simply learning about history and considering our future actions, but what role empathy does play in that. Can you explain why why you attached empathy to our thinking about both previous and future generations?
So it turns out that I touched on a little bit of this, but it turns out, and I'll go backwards and then we'll go forward. And that's the way we should do it.
Sure.
I explain why in the book, but I won't go into it right now because people will be like, "Oh, okay, that's too much." What part of what holds us back, Michael, when it comes to, and I talk about in the book kind of examined desired futures, not just your desire. Let me go back a little bit more. I'm going to counter myself. The thing that we haven't talked about in the book is the difference between future thinking, singular, and futures thinking with a plural. And the reason I talk about that as being a kind of a pillar of Longpath is because more often than not, we're stuck in what's called an official future. So I get asked to talk on these panels all the time where it's like, all right, come on and talk about the future of cities or the future of transportation or the future of education, as if there is only one singular future. And when you do that, you close the aperture of what is possible. And you're more often than not living in somebody else's idea of what the future should be. Why is it their idea? Because we inherit these things. So when we inherit the good and the bad. So if you want to get to kind of an examined desired future, you first have to go back and understand the operating system and the context of those who came before you. In the book, obviously, it's parents and grandparents. It's kind of your own lineage, but it's also something much, much more macro and very macro in the fact that we have to think about the past couple of 100,000 years of who got you to where you are today. And so, what empathy does is more often than not, when we think about kind of self-awareness and personal empathy, what we do is we look at the past and we say, oh, well, these, my parents or my grandparents made these decisions and they were terrible and they impacted me this way. And this is why I'm in such a hole or in such a rut. And that's the kind of, Marty Seligman talks about this as a kind of Freudian way of looking at the world, which is through the DSM. These are all the things that are wrong with us as opposed to all the things that are right with us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason we use empathy is because it's not about letting the past off the hook and saying, oh, well, they did it this way because there was a different context. It's about looking back and saying, okay, my parents, I'm not speaking for myself, but someone, folks will say, my parents were emotionally unavailable and that's why I'm in this place right now. And I'm so mad at them. Instead of doing that, which is understandable, and you can start there, it's about understanding the context from which they operated in, which was being raised by your grandparents and their grandparents. And what empathy allows you to start doing is understanding that more often than not, folks are doing the best they can with what they have at the current moment. Why this is so important in terms of looking backwards is because what this does is when you start to have empathy for your own ancestors, you understand that at some point, you're going to want your descendants to have empathy for you in your operating context. And so, again, what this does is it opens us up to a better understanding of where we came from, not just through the negative, but through the context of understanding so that we can wrestle with it and then move forward. So that's empathy, the short version, much a whole chapter on this, the short version of empathy for the past. Empathy for the self, which I've already touched on, what that allows you to start doing is, in layman's term, is stop beating yourself up for where you are right now and what's going on. And kind of, we live in, especially in America, in a culture of hyper actualization. And if you are not living your life like the latest quote that you saw on Instagram, something must be radically wrong with you, right? Because you're not living up to this ultimate, you're not the top of the Maslow's hierarchy of pyramid of that. Look, like I've met a lot of these folks, like very few, very, very, very few folks are at that level. And by the way, the ones who are usually not on Instagram. They're actually out there doing something incredible in the world. They don't have time to be on Instagram because they are literally in the basement of a church feeding people and carrying them and doing that. And not knocking people with big followers, but just remember that as you scroll. And so empathy for the self allows you to kind of open up more to the moment. Okay, would that start and to yourself and to what made you who you are and starting to think about the futures you want in an examined way as opposed to the ones that were thrust upon you, right? Now let's go to empathy for the future. Why is this so important? Well, I'll tell you, it's kind of like there's a little bit of a hack here. And I don't talk about this as much in the book. And I realize I probably should have talked about it a little bit more, but I do reference it. Emotions, so Freud will say emotions are about kind of wrestling with the past, but the latest kind of research out of the folks on the Longpath Labs advisory board, like Jamil Zaki out of Stanford or David Esteno Northeastern, and a whole bunch of folks, Lisa Cohen Barrett, are saying this, that emotions are really meant at the neuroscience level to not be something that we spin our wheels on about the past, but they're actually there to help us make better decisions about the future. Right? Marty Seligman doesn't call us Homo sapiens, he calls us Homo prospectus, which means we do two things that no other mammals can do. We think about the future through multiple scenarios and stories, and we have the ability to cooperate into getting there. Now, I'll add a third layer, which was if and when we're able to attach emotions to the visions of the futures that we want, we are actually more likely to get to them. Now, for you to believe that, you do have to let go of the idea that emotions are only about kind of the past, but they're actually are built around biasing future behaviors. And so, Michael, when I ask folks to think about their future descendants and connect to them, not just cognitively, not just cognitive empathy, but really emotionally, and kind of feel and understand where they are and what is it that you want them to feel in the moment, in the year 21, 21, 22 and 31, 22. What is the feelings that you want them to have? Lo and behold, all the research shows us you are much more likely to take behavioral action that will lead to your descendants living in those futures than if you just did it cognitively. So that's highfalutin. What does that mean broken down? If I say, okay, draw me a picture of what you want, let's say Denver to look like 100 years from now. Like we'll call it the Denver 2150 project, right? And you'll probably most folks will draw like monorails and solar, kind of a solar punk, this really great thing. But then then, now we've introduced the future and like, wow, that's really cool. How do I make decisions to kind of help that manifest? And you will do that because already you have a vision in mind. But if we add the emotional layer to that vision, and I say, Michael, how do you want folks to feel in that city when they look at the vertical farm or the regenerative, aquaponic tilapia bed that is happening out? How do you want them to feel? All of a sudden, when you kind of emotionally anchor to those future descendants, you are much more likely to take those actions. We don't exactly know why this is the case, but Hal Hirschfeld at UCLA, a bunch of folks have done experiments around this, obviously not going out 100 years, but we know when you are emotionally connected to future generations, you are much more likely to take actions on their behalf than if you just had a vision of it. I mentioned Hal Hirschfeld. I mentioned him in the book, and I just mentioned him right now. He did this amazing work at UCLA where he puts people into an fMRI machine, where a functional MRI machine where you kind of see where the oxygen in the blood flow is. So you see what's being activated. And he says to them, okay, I want you to think of yourself like right now. And, people can't see me, but, one part of the brain lights up. And then he says, okay, I want you to think of, someone famous like Matt Damon, and another part of the brain lights up. And he goes, okay, I want you to think about yourself 10 years from now. And you know exactly what happens. The part of the brain that lit up for Matt Damon is the same part that lights up for yourself 10 years from now. So you kind of know who this Ari in 10 years is, but you're not connected. Pulls them out of the fMRI machine, and there's a control group, nothing gets done. The other group, and they've done different versions of this with VR or just 2D, they'll show you a photo of yourself to age 10 years from now. They'll also do this thing where you can write a letter to your future self. And you know what happens when they bring those folks back into the fMRI machine, the folks that had the interventions where they were asked to write letters to their future selves and kind of connect about the goals and desires from it, and they were also able to see them, are much more likely, and then, they have these interesting experiments, like how much money would you put away for life insurance, all these things, are much more likely to take behaviors on behalf of their future selves. And so in Longpath and in the book and in the mindset, we take this work and we extrapolate it. So it's no longer not just for you. It's great if it's for you, and you should do that. You'll become a much healthier person if you are looking at a freezer full of ice cream versus other better food for you, and you're thinking about yourself 10 years from now, you're going to make better choices. But that's not enough anymore. You actually, when you extrapolate that, you make better choices and ways of being for future generations. And the final byproduct of that, which is the most amazing part, is when you start living through this kind of empathy-based decision matrix, you actually, yes, you know exactly what happens. Your ability to be more self-aware and connected to individuals outside your own egoic self actually goes off the charts. So it's kind of this like trifecta of great things that happen when you bring empathy for the past, present, and future into the way that you see the world.
So let me ask a question that is rolling around in my head, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to articulate it exactly how it's I want it to, but in hearing that, especially in light of the fMRI results that you just detailed, seeing that and knowing that even if we just think about our future selves and in the behaviors and the feelings and the emotions that we want them to have and experience, it's a fact really that over the last probably 10 years, we have really dug into therapy and it becoming more streamlined and modernized and something that we talk about and we're not dismissive of. And it's so often we recount our trauma to specific things that happened to us in our past, and we usually relate it to individual people, our parents or friends or, an acquaintance who traumatized us in some way. Why is it so hard for us to seemingly, I'll say, accept that that same trauma or similar traumas can happen from society's effect, the effect that society has, and the societal level traumas that we have experienced recently. Why do we not seem to deal with that part of it when we talk about transgenerational empathy? Is my question making any sort of sense?
It not only doesn't make sense. I've been doing this for a while. It's the first person to actually ask this question. It's such a good question. Look, and again, I'll do this through through a Western lens. The fact of the matter is, remember I talked about kind of the myths and narratives that are breaking down that we're seeing break down in this moment in this intertitle.
Yes.
One of the big myths and monomyths actually of American Western culture is this idea of rugged individualism. It's a kind of cowboy archetype that cuts across gender and race, but in America, especially, it's all about the individual. It's all about the I. It's all about the me. It's not about the we or the us. And so that is both, that monomyth happens when we talk about, the CEO who has a $15 billion market cap. He did it alone. No, he didn't. Right? No one did or does. Yes, sometimes yes. I was a pole vaulter. A lot of what I did when I pole vaulting was I was only my hands on the pole. Yes. But it was also my training and my trainers and all the other stuff. So, but the fact of the matter is, it's difficult for us to do it because we can't even wrap our heads around this idea of a collective we in general, in the beneficial sense. Right? It's all so hyper focused. I mean, I talked about this earlier. If you look at again, I sound like I'm being derisive, but I'm not, because I just was in a bookstore and I was signing books, and there was Longpath in the self-help section. And I said to the woman, I go, this is a self-help section. Like, is there a we help section? Because I want to be in that section. I want to, where's that intersectional section between I help and those current events and so it's difficult for us to kind of acknowledge systemic transgenerational trauma. You see this acutely when it comes to issues around race in America and slavery. It's always about the kind of the individual. And now, look, without going into the politics of it, I think it gets very complicated because there is a role for the I and the individual and individual work to be done, as well as collective. And so I'm going to, as I stepped into that pot of boiling water, I'm going to gently step myself back out of it. And say it's complicated, but you are correct in that we don't like to acknowledge any kind of collective we in there, because what ends up happening, especially in this country around transgenerational trauma, is that it either becomes victim blaming or overt oppressor blaming when it goes up to a systems level approach. And we haven't quite figured out the balance between these two seemingly false binaries of the individual and the collective. But more often than not, you are 100% correct, Michael, in that we will very much focus on the individual. So we'll look at an individual, let's say in an inner city, and say, well, it is their fault they are in this situation. And there's never this kind of group collective accountability, because to do that, I think, is very difficult for us to process, because we then start to have to be implicated in these larger systems, and that's not something that we do in America. We don't do well, or if we try to do it, we can kind of get messy around it, and we may go so far that then it's all systems and no individual. And so I think part of what we're seeing in this intertitle is trying to kind of balance both our analysis of situations of how we got there and our kind of normative strategies for moving into another kind of better place.
Ari, one of the passages that I highlighted with just a single sentence in the book that said, relational tension can be a good thing. Now, you're not going to get any argument out of me from that. So I'm not going to ask you why that is. I believe that to be true. Anybody who's heard this show knows that. So I want to ask you, what does it look like when relational tension is a good thing?
Well, we can go through. It's interesting because it's a great segue from the last question, but now I know why you're good at what you do.
Thank you.
The first kind of internal, when we talk about relational tension being a good thing, I could start anywhere in this, but I'm going to start at the eternal, but in the internal sphere, the internal way that, the God, was it Aristotle said, the ability to kind of balance two different perspectives and not be necessarily I'm messing up this quote, but not being necessarily beholden to one of them, but able to hold them at the same time.
Yes,
That
the
dynamic,
Aristotle's mean, I believe.
yes,
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been a long one. Is unbelievably important because in that dynamic relational tension is where the creative juice and the superpowers of who and what we are happens. And when we go too far in agreement on one thing, this kind of false success story starts to happen. So to be clear, I'm obviously Hegelian, right? So there's kind of this thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And so that's what relational tension is. And now that being said, and we talked about this a little bit before I think we started recording, we have lost the ability to kind of do that in debate with one another in this country. So we don't even argue well. So we don't know we don't know what it is that we're heading towards. We're still thinking in this kind of binary winner take all zero sum game. Again, it's kind of coming out of the Enlightenment. To take that sentence from the book, relational tension is really good. And it's something that has to be done kind of when there's kind of an ethical layer attached to that relational tension, in that we're assuming that the two parties that are in tension with each other, and by the way, those two parties could be my inner voice and my egoic layer, as well as Michael and Ari, as well as us in another country. If we assume best intentions because we are trying to get to a synthesis, trying to get to a higher level of order from the chaos, it can work. The issue becomes when the parties involved in that are no longer focused on achieving a higher order or a higher level of order, and are more focused on a kind of zero sum, which, by the way, is going to happen in intertidal because we become very short-term thinking because we've lost the official future and we become scared and we don't know what's going to come next. So what ends up happening is it becomes, and I mean this both at the political level, but also on the internal level, we can become seeking of authoritarian strongman voices, be it from an actual podium at a rally or even within ourselves in terms of being blocked to the relational tension that will get us to a better place. We just want answers now because we are scared because we don't understand what is going to happen next.
And is all that characteristic of what you described in the book as being a full spectrum human being? Is to bring it back to the beginning, I guess, yeah. Ari, of this conversation, is that what you meant by that? To be able to hold in conversation, in communication, that tension with an eye towards commonality for an examined, desired future, that it is not just one future that in destination and point in time, but that it is we're on this journey of the future together. Is that what you meant by that?
I mean, I know I'm not supposed to talk like this on a podcast, but yes, like 100%, you got it. So anyone listening, you still have to get the book and read the book, but yes, that's it, right? I mean, the thing, what I will add in that is, I only two places in the book. You always write something. It takes a while for it to come out, for them to publish it and whatnot. But I mentioned two places in the book this idea of what I call the project, which is this idea of like a better Homo sapiens, living a kind of full spectrum humanity way of being, so that we move into futures that are something beyond what we could think of. And it's interesting. I was just in a talk the other night, and someone was talking about kind of futures beyond ones that we could imagine. They said that to me. And I go, well, what does that mean to you? And the entire kind of list of what they gave me was all based on the technology of those futures, right? Like how we'll eat, how we'll get along, like all these very kind of external things. I'm like, oh my God, that totally sounds amazing. It's regenerative, all these things. And I go, so like, are people happier? Like, how are people living? Like, how are people in conversation with one another? Like, how do they think about that inner voice that, by the way, we think is a neutral party and totally isn't, because society and our parents and everything created that inner voice. Like, tell me more about, and I ended the conversation, not ended, but then I said, so tell me in this fantastical, future, what's the, like, how are people's inner voices different? and they just like blank stare, right? Because it was the way we are trained to think is so externalized around kind of these futures that we want. And in Longpath, I'm not knocking that. I want all those external things that are amazing, or seemingly amazing, but done in a way that doesn't come to the detriment of future generations because of the way we have to make them or create them or run them or energize them. That being said, when someone tells me about these magnificent futures, that's my new go-to question. Tell me about the inner voice. What is it? First of all, where did it come from? How is it manifesting? How is it beautiful and driven towards the light as opposed to something that's like chaotic and swirly and keeping people up at night? Look, I don't want to come across as Pollyannish, and we can live in this, like, I did in my 20s. I was kind of spent a lot of my time at a Soto Zen Center, San Francisco Zen Center, and reading a lot of Krishnamurti and like following these folks and listening, reading, doing the study. Even these folks, all the books that are in all these sections, they all said, look, to be totally clear, like the goal isn't to eradicate all of these things and somehow join with the internal astral plane and not be. You still need to be grounded and connected in this beautiful thing called humanity and being a human. But so much of it is driven by living unexaminedly about how we got to this point. And most importantly to me, is an unexamined way of thinking about where we want to go.
Beautifully said. I love that question. Tell me more about the inner voice. I'm going to start using that. I'll credit you, Ari.
Give me credit, yes. And by the way, if you want to turn that into a quote on Instagram and just tag me, like, you can still do it. I realized I said that earlier and I sounded like high and mighty. I didn't mean to be high and mighty. I was just saying that and by the way, I'm only speaking from personal experience. I was on Instagram earlier and I was like, oh my God, that's why am I not living like that? And I was like, wait, why? What?
Yeah.
Like, the only one who benefited from me reading that was anyone who owns stock shares in Meta, because I spent more time on the site. And then when I did that, I was like, okay, I'm going to go back to kind of thinking about my life and the one I want to live, and not necessarily increasing money for shareholders of Meta. So
I can get behind that for sure.
Yeah.
Ari, what's a question that you wish you were asked more?
I don't know, like the past 4 questions you asked were all the questions I wanted. I don't think I'm going to do a podcast again. I think I've hit peak podcast in these questions. A question that I wish I was asked more is, am I doing, and this is going to sound like super morbid and out of left field, but it'll make sense when you read the book. Am I doing everything I can to move from death anxious to totally death aware? And so everyone's like, what? Where did that come from? One of the things I talk about that's kind of a blockage when it comes to the Ari. I apologize for the third person. I'm just used to that. Like Ari
You're
or
fine.
Michael or all these folks.
You're fine.
Thinking about the future in general in the world, especially in the West, is that to truly think about what it means to be a great ancestor in your decision making and in your living and your kind of living long path requires that you think about the world after you are gone.
Yeah.
And so more often than not, Ernest Becker wrote The Denial of Death, won the 1972 Pulitzer Prize for this. You know what the book is about based on the title. So our death denialism keeps us from really thinking about futures that we want for the larger Homo sapien project. And so I think about, death. Both of my parents passed away when I was my mom a couple of years ago, my dad when I was 18. So I think about it a lot. And now that I'm a father to 3 children, I'm kind of thinking, okay, am I making it sounds pretty heavy, but like, am I making the decisions that I'm making right now? I want to make these decisions. So I'm being a great ancestor and a great father and a great husband and a great friend. But is the one element that I am not examining enough constantly is the role of kind of like egoic death and biological death and how I'm making these decisions. So the question I'd like to be asked more is, am I doing enough? And so if I'm answering the own question that I asked myself, the answer is no. And it's kind of like the next area I think I'm going to kind of explore more in kind of thinking, writings, and teachings, as well as kind of doing the work of promulgating the long path mindset out to folks who are receptive to it. I don't think long path is the only way you navigate an intertidal. It's the way that I think can be beneficial to a lot of folks, but a lot of folks will find it not for them, either they'll find something else. But more than anything, what I want people listening to kind of take away is it's time to find a practice and a way of seeing and being in the world that recognizes the moment that we're in, and very, very importantly, recognizes that what's going to see us through this moment is having a felt vision of what it is that you want to see the world like. Not utopian, not dystopian, but the world that you want, that you are contributing to over the next hundreds of years, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, using that to help you make decisions very large, but also extremely small. How you say hi to people, how you talk to yourself, your inner voice, your inner child. Think about all of those as nested within this decision matrix that are helping contribute to far off better tomorrows, as well as kind of the tomorrow.
Beautiful. Ari, if people want to join you on that journey, on that exploration, how can they connect with you, get a copy of the book, which is Longpath, Becoming the Great Ancestors Our Future Needs? How can people connect with you, sir?
Well, they can obviously get the book anywhere books are sold. Not obviously, but anywhere online. If there's a local bookstore, please go to your local bookstore. And if they don't have a copy, ask to order a copy. Support those local to you. I'm not knocking the big ones, but just sometimes try to keep it local so those tax dollars stay local. You can go to longpath.org, sign up for the newsletter. We're going to be starting up. This is actually for your audience. Really, we'll probably connect with this. We were doing this right before the pandemic. They were called Longpath Gather. So these were kind of groups run by us, but also by kind of trained facilitators. It was, started off with reading the book, but really recognizing that Longpath in and of itself, you'll see when you read the book, the first 2/3 are about you and the work that you need to do and how you kind of see the world. But the back part of it is really about Longpath being relational. And so how you practice it, how you live it should be in your moment to moment. How you say goodbye to your kids or your spouse or your partner in the morning is if you do it in a certain way, it can be living Longpath. But if you want a place to kind of practice it and talk about the ideas of it and go way beyond what I wrote, because I only wrote like a drop in the bucket of how we can think like this, not because I couldn't write more, but because those ideas don't just all exist within me. I'm just kind of a catalyst to start the conversation. You can sign up for Longpath Gathers that are happening in cities around the country and eventually around the world. And there's all sorts of social stuff on there too. But the newsletter, Longpath Gather, buy the book. And by the way, if you don't do any of those things and you're just listening to this great podcast, next time you go to make a decision, whether, between the action and the reaction, there's about a millisecond in there. But if you can open that up and, for me, I just say like Longpath because it's a kind of a mantra that I can do. But if you want something longer or bigger at first, just say, okay, how I'm thinking about making the decision, which one is going to be more about being a great ancestor or less making a great ancestor? And if you start doing that for those decisions, you will just in and of itself start making more. If you go towards the great ancestor side of things, which by the way, you can't always, I understand that, you will start leading to helping us make those better futures and tomorrows for our descendants. And for that, I thank you.
Beautiful stuff. Ari, thank you so much. I enjoyed this. I enjoyed the book, and best wishes to you. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about it.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much to Ari Wallach for sharing his story and perspective on the show this week. Please do me and Ari a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to our conversation. Share this episode with your network. Help me spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions and communicating well with each other. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Ari that I have on each and every episode, subscribe so that you never miss when a new episode drops. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to my website. It's michaelashford.com, and you can reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.